Hi everyone. I'm sadly going to have to run right after this, but it was great to hear your presentations. Are you aware of the group Bobbies and Zaidis Against the Occupation? They're a really interesting group, and I want to bring in the occupation a bit. And I think starting with this photo, which was taken 2 weeks ago. You can see on top, I think it's what you finished your presentation with, right? The women's protests fighting for women's right, understanding, right on top, understanding the danger in the judicial overhaul to women's rights. You can see in the protests, people standing with LGBTQ flags, the fear of how this overhaul will affect minority communities or LGBTQ communities is definitely something that we see in the protests, and part of what has been evolved, and this is I think due not only to as Gilad described it, but a few years now of protests, maybe even going back to what is called the Black Flags or the Balfour protests. There's been a bunch of organization activists that have formed around what is called the anti-occupation bloc, right? Gush Neged HaKibush. And before I say a word about nonviolent resistance sort of as a method and talking a bit about some successes, I think, in the field with nonviolence, I think that the protest movement is a very interesting moment where we can see two very key struggles that are playing out within the Israeli society. And I think that when we're talking about the current protest movement, there are definitely protesters, and definitely all the protesters are fighting for liberal rights or liberal issues. The protest is not necessarily a progressive protest, and specifically the protest is definitely not about Palestinian rights. There are elements within the protest movement that will bring up Palestinian rights. The anti-occupation bloc will bring up Palestinian rights, but what do they call Mata Mavak? The central command of the protest movement does not have within its organizations anti-occupation organizations. And maybe one of the most interesting moments, I was there, it wasn't that interesting while it was happening, but interesting retrospectively, was 2 weeks ago. This sign, as you can see, it's a chovah, it's an obligation to oppose settler terror, right? This is a reaction to a wave of settler violence that came after a terrorist attack killing 4 Israelis, a wave of terror attacks in the occupied territories, and sort of an action-reaction, a massive attack on the Palestinian community of both Turmusaya, Safa, what many have called the pogrom. This sort of came after a similar attack in Hawara just a few weeks before. And there were a few attempts to react to this. One of them was the anti-occupation bloc, for the first time, gathered some money and produced this massive poster. There are a few dozen people underneath this poster, and the idea was to take this message into the center of the protest, and not start in the Kaplan Pinat da Vinci, where they usually stand, and basically come from the east. And as they're walking from east to west, down Hashalom Street, they get to the center of the protests. And there they meet, or we met, a group called Achim LaNeshek, Brothers in Arms, right? One of the key groups of the protest movement, who saw what this sign says, who saw some of the shirts that some of the folks had, right? No democracy with occupation, some Palestinian flags, Israeli flags as well, and basically attacked the group physically. I think this moment clarifies these two struggles going on, because alongside a liberal struggle within Israel, or maybe even a progressive struggle on many issues that Israeli citizens are struggling and fighting on many different ways, many different fronts, much before this protest movement, women's rights, minority rights, LGBTQ. These are real issues that Israeli citizens need to fight for, right? When I'm thinking about, the things the country I want to live in, these are core issues within my country. And this is a real struggle. This is a civil struggle within the Israeli society, right? You have different tools in this struggle. You can vote, you can protest, right? Not everyone fighting for these rights has equal rights, but there is a potential, at least, for equality within this civil space. This isn't true for migrant workers or asylum seekers, but generally speaking, this is part of the protest. Alongside these issues, Israel is maintaining a military occupation, right? Israel is maintaining a military dictatorship, right? The conversation about apartheid, yes, no, where does it start? Where does this end? There's definitely another issue here, right? Or the elephant in the room that is taking place. And when Israelis go to the street to fight for Israeli democracy, how can you do that with ignoring the fact that we're maintaining, right, our control over millions of people indefinitely? And I think even more so, what allowed this block, or maybe the blind spot within some of the protest movement makes it even more urgent, is that the people leading the judicial overhaul, right? Some of the members of parliament leading, this, what many believe, this dangerous process within the Israeli society and changing our legal system, are not only supporters of the settler movement, not only settlers themselves in many cases, but say pretty openly that a big part of what motivates them, right? We're definitely talking about Rotman or Smotrich or Ben-Gvir. What motivates them is entrenchment of the occupation and annexing the territories. They're moving on that already. And in that sense, this protest really managed, on the one hand, I agree, bring everyone, to the streets, right? Or almost everyone to the streets who opposes the policies of the government, but also exposed, I think, a very deep chasm within the liberal/progressive camp. And the dynamic around the protest movement, I think, is very, very interesting, and a very interesting case study in learning about the limits of nonviolence. I'll give you one example, and then I actually want to give a concrete example of a nonviolent sort of method that I think we can learn from when it comes to the occupied territories. But one of the symbols of this protest is the Israeli flag. And I've heard, I don't know if this is 100% true or if this is just sort of what affected some, but some of the explanations for you using the Israeli flag in this way were some of the Palestinian flags that were brought up in the first protest, before the umbrella protest, the first one. There was one before, and Israeli flags. And I think that was interesting, because you sort of needed that action and reaction, or maybe that mirror image to say, what are we not? But just picking up a flag, right, mobilized change, right, and made people very angry. And we see this in the anti-occupation bloc. Seeing the flag will, do something. It's a non-violent action, obviously, to pick up a flag. Going to become much more difficult on campuses now with the new bill passed by the government. But you can see the action and reaction with this very nonviolent example. I have 5 more minutes. And in that sense, I think just looking at the dynamic in that anti-occupation bloc is interesting, because alongside the mobilization and the anti-occupation bloc has grown immensely, and in other places as well. We see also in some cities like Jerusalem has also become an integral part of the speakers, not only people speaking on stage, but also managing to bring, I think, pretty brave speakers like the sister of Iyad al-Halak in Jerusalem, who spoke or said a prayer. But I think part of the interesting dynamic that is happening is that we see the transition from the streets in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to the activism in the OPT, occupied Palestinian territories. And I think this is one of the interesting things that is probably also happening in other circles, but is definitely visible within the anti-occupation blocs. And groups like Breaking the Silence, which I'm a member of and director, or a group of former Israeli soldiers, as we mentioned, and a lot of what we do is alongside gathering testimonies from soldiers, we also guide tours in the occupied territories. And through these tours, we've built some pretty interesting and brave relationships with Palestinian families and Palestinian communities. Namely, one of them is in the South Hebron Hills. And one of the things that we see, because we're very active in the South Hebron Hills, and there's sort of new activists who are sort of growing within the protest, is there's an interest to go in and meet Palestinians and do activism, not only stand in a shirt that says there's no democracy with occupation, but actually go see it with your own eyes. And there's been a bunch of groups. Looking at Occupation in Your Eyes is one of them, but many other organizations that are not only formed, but also mobilizing people. And what we see in terms of nonviolence, and I think the lesson we can learn in nonviolence is the importance of transitioning people from the protest and taking another step into activism. And I think we see this in a very good way. The activism is not only going and seeing, but it's actually joining protective presence groups. One of the interesting things that we see in the South Hebron Hills, in the Jordan Valley, is this ecosystem that has been created, this ecosystem of nonviolence, where in the one hand, the Palestinian communities are welcoming for Israelis, not trivial, doesn't happen everywhere, anti-normalization or so on. In the South Hebron Hills, they're welcoming to this dynamic. So having protective presence, together with a very smart legal team and media and advocacy team, actually managed to change and shift the reality on the ground. And the more numbers of Israelis coming, joining, understanding this dynamic, joining the protective presence, we can actually see an ability for the Palestinians to go back to their lands. And in places like Susia in the South Hebron Hills, 10 years ago, there were families who left because of settler violence. And we've seen in recent weeks other cases where we don't have this dynamic or this ecosystem of nonviolence. People are leaving. When you create this ecosystem of security, people are there. You have media protection, right? You have a legal protection. It creates an atmosphere that allows families to come back. And in the end, part of the what we think could be one of the most important things that this moment could do is I don't know if wake up the entire center left or the entire liberal camp, but definitely show these cracks. And I'll end with one thing that I think has become sort of a bit of a semi-symbol of the protest in some moments. And I don't know how many of the folks here, those listening to us, know about this, but after the pogrom in Hawara, right, after attacking Palestinians in Hawara, 400 settlers, attacking, burning homes and so on, part of what Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, right, where that's the ability to connect the dots and to show that you can't really have a powerful democracy while constantly controlling another people is something that I believe people are waking up to, and believe that those who are not waking up to it should wake up to it, because the connections between the attempt to entrench the reality of the OPT, to maintain the occupation, to annex the territories, are directly connected to the And thank you for that.